Brandon, Bitcoin went as high as 108,000, but now it's crashed and went as low as 90,000. There's all this talk about a strong dollar, rising yields, and the Fed not cutting in 2025. What do you make of all this?
Hey, man, thanks for having me. I make of it's a bunch of baloney, man. It's a lot of short-term price movement. Everybody likes to think the world is absolutely crashing, right? But if you look at all the macro events, I'm looking at the United States proposing to sell 69,000 Bitcoin because the DOJ passed it from the Silk Road assets. All coincidentally, right before President Trump gets into office. I think they passed that like 11 or 12 days officially after seizing those coins for nearly a decade. So the timing seems a little bit fishy. I think the dollar is getting a little bit stronger. Obviously we still have our inflationary concerns. One of my favorite websites to go on is govflation.com. They really just break down like how they used to calculate metrics like CPI and other things. And if you look at the difference between the way that CPI was reported in September back to how it was reported prior to the first basket of good change post getting off the gold standard, we're at like an 8% difference. The Fed reported at, I believe it was like 2.5 or 2.8. And in September, it was still at like 10.6 in according to the 1982 basket of goods. So I think the average person is still feeling the inflation. But on the flip side of things, we're getting a president in who loves his assets, who loves to have very, very low interest rate environment. And so I think he's going to put a lot of pressure on Jerome Powell to cut interest rates, even with inflation not under control, which is going to make for a bonkers of a year for 2025 for Bitcoin and all assets in general.
I agree, definitely. I mean, Trump's personal KPI, so to speak, for his first term was the stock market and assets. And even at Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville, he flexed, oh yeah, Bitcoin went up whatever 1,000% in my administration, but only a couple 100% in Biden's administration. So you have to think he's going to want to beat that number. And you bring up a great point about CPI, and I'll kind of elaborate for the audience why this is the case. It's because as the price of goods go up, you lower your quality of goods, right? So maybe back in the 80s or 90s, you're buying grass-fed beef. And the price of that, because you can't print cows overnight, when they print dollars, the price of that high-quality meat is going to go up versus, say, soy meat or Beyond Meat that you can mass produce in a factory, lower quality of good. All right, it's the price of grass-fed beef went up. You may substitute some of the lower quality meat into your diet. And so now they're comparing the price of the grass-fed beef versus a totally different product, which is the soy, crappy, not real meat. And so over time, you could see how that just compounds. And eventually you're measuring the price of goods you were not buying decades ago. And they can use this to manipulate the real rate of change in prices.
100%. And I mean, that's what's happening. I believe they took out food and shelter in the CPI basket of goods this time because they saw such a dramatic increase. So it's absolutely ridiculous. And then they're citing things like, hey, the gas prices are better this year. They're down 50% from $4.50 a gallon to $3.75 a gallon, where the previous administration had it, nearly around $2 a gallon. So, it's all just like moving the bar and looking at it in a different respect, man. And I think that the government's been using data to not only manipulate us, but try to manipulate the perception of the way things are going. And I think the American people have had it. I think everybody has woken up, and I think that's why we saw such a landslide victory for the president-elect Trump here to come in again, because everybody realized that the economy was so much better under President Trump than under Biden. Now, I don't think that President Trump has an easy task ahead of us with the amount of debt that this administration has accumulated in this past 4 years. And a bunch of other factors, too, I'm sure we'll get into here in a minute. But it's definitely going to be a bit of a clash, I believe, with Jerome Powell and Donald Trump, where he's going to try to keep his Volcker moment, try to keep interest rates very high. But on the flip side of things, President Trump's going to want to lower those interest rates. And we'll see who ends up winning at the end. My money's on Trump. And that means good things for the Bitcoin price. But I don't know if it means great things for beating inflation.
I'm glad you brought that up because that was actually one of the questions I wanted to get to is, do you envision this kind of battle, so to speak, between Trump and Powell? And who do you actually think is more powerful in the end? Is it the president or is it the Federal Reserve?
The Federal Reserve is definitely more powerful to answer your second question, just because the monetary supply controls everything, right? I mean, as Bitcoiners, we all know it touches every single aspect of our life: the food, the shelter, whatever it is, the quality of the goods that you were just going over here previously. Deflating the currency, inflating the currency, excuse me, just lowers the quality of life for everybody around the globe, especially when the US dollar is a global reserve currency. But I think that President Trump is unique in a respect that he has more cultural influence. He's more polarizing than maybe any other president we've had previously. And so he will be very outspoken about Jerome Powell, and people will go to bat for Trump no matter what he says. And so I don't know if Jerome Powell really wants to get elected again or be put back in power and become the Fed chair again in another 2 years. But it's been interesting because when Powell was previously in or when Trump was previously in office, Trump was telling, hey, lower interest rates. And then in 2019, when Powell tried to raise interest rates for a little bit, it showed cracks in the economy. And he was like, what the hell are you doing here, man? And then Biden used that as a talking point, saying, hey, the Fed is supposed to be bipartisan. They're not supposed to have any political leanings or anything like that. And then what happened in this past couple of years? Joe Biden did the same exact thing that President Trump did, trying to get Powell to lower interest rates. So they're going to have those political pressures. But I think that Trump, in a sense, even though Biden and Trump technically had the same position, I think Trump, when he's in office, has more power than Biden. But to answer your question, I think the Fed chair is the ultimate guy behind the scenes pulling the strings, to say the very least.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And it seems like Trump is getting past a hot potato, right? Because inflation is not going down towards their target, and CPI is probably not going to, for 2023 and 2024, we saw disinflation, right? Lower CPIs, but now that energy prices have kind of stabilized, that's not going to be driving down CPI. So inflation is sticky. The treasury market is just performed abysmally over the last few months. What do you think Trump can do? Because it seems to me that high inflation is the main problem facing Americans right now. And I don't see how he can lower inflation while also achieving his goals of more U.S. onshore manufacturing and all that sort of stuff. So where's your mind at with this?
Yeah, so I think it's going to be an initial battle in the first year or two of his administration, to say the very least, right? I mean, it's the drill, baby, drill, and the mass deportation, trying to bring in more American jobs. It's going to take time, to say the very least. But with the massive tariffs that he's threatening, I mean, it's going to put a lot of incentive on people to move very quickly. So I think the first year, we're still going to be battling inflation. Everything's not going to be peaches and daisies when Trump gets into office Jan 20th. I'm sure we'll see a little Bitcoin run up that day, just because of the hype around it and everything else. And obviously, Bitcoin's the most liquid market on the planet, and so we'll see a lot of people start to flock towards that. But in the long term, I guess for this entire year, for 2025, I think it's going to be tough to battle inflation. I think, he's going to try to lower interest rates to make businesses really try to quickly get jobs back over to the United States, but it's going to be a process. I think it's going to take another year or two, or maybe 2.5. Maybe we'll finally complete battling inflation by the end of his administration in 2029 or late 2028 as well. I don't think it's necessarily going to be an easy battle for him to fight here. And I think it's going to be interesting, though, because the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve that everybody is now going to be flocking towards that, to see how Trump is going to use that to potentially, potentially eliminate a lot of the debt. That would be something that I think would be able to potentially battle inflation. Now, how does he do it? I'm not really sure. I've been under the thesis that this Bitcoin strategic reserve is going to be out in the public, that, all these bills that they're going to pass, they're going to buy 200,000 Bitcoin every single year for 5 years, hold it for 20. That's what Senator Lummis laid out. And to me, that was going to be very, very bullish, where we would see something blow off the top here in this calendar year, because everybody would try to front run it. If governments are known to be hodlers, which, they're essentially signing that into law, hey, we have to hodl, and they're on a scheduled buying schedule. Well, I mean, who, as a traditional finance guy or with a lot of money sitting on the sidelines, who wouldn't want to front run that to try to get cheaper sats? As we know, the US government, maybe the Canadian government, maybe the Colombian government, maybe all of these other governments. I mean, there's 25 other countries looking at a strategic reserve right now, all announced since President Trump was elected just 2 months ago. So I think that the nation state FOMO is coming, and President Trump is going to have to potentially use Bitcoin to help battle not only keeping the strength in the dollar, but also battling inflation here at home. And so I think 2025 is going to be a wonkers of a year, to say the very least here, Mitch.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And the cat's kind of out of the bag once nation states start FOMOing into Bitcoin. I mean, there's no more, I can't imagine what FUD no coiners would pull out at that point. I think obviously countries accumulating Bitcoin is a signal to the world that, hey, we won. Bitcoiners were right about this thing. Will Trump back the dollar with Bitcoin? And how exactly would that work? And should he do this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The short answer to that is no. I don't think it's even possible to really implement something like that within a 4-year term. So when RFK went up there and said that, prior to just backing Trump, I thought it was very advantageous to say, hey, I'm going to try to back the dollar with Bitcoin. How it would potentially work was building the strategic reserve in the initial period, in my eyes. So I think in order to back the dollar with Bitcoin, it's going to take years of accumulating Bitcoin to thus strengthen the dollar and get us out of this debt spiral that we're in right now. To be honest, like, the government rakes in more and more money every single year, but the government has a spending problem. So the DOGE, the DOGE, right, Department of Government Efficiency, is going to be monumental here as well for the strength of the dollar, because, a lot of aspects like GDP and all these other data points that they promote, saying, oh, GDP is going up, so everything is looking all peaches and daisies here in the economy. Well, part of GDP is government spending. So they've been increasing government spending by sending millions and millions and millions of dollars to Ukraine. And a little caveat here, I believe the third or fourth largest holder of Bitcoin is the Ukraine when it comes to different countries holding Bitcoin. So maybe they're using our tax dollars to buy Bitcoin, but that's another aside that maybe we could get into a little bit later. But I think, with all of that, I don't necessarily think that Trump is going to back the dollar with Bitcoin. I think that's going to be a very tall task. I think step number one is building the Bitcoin strategic reserve, seeing how it goes from there. And I still think Trump needs to do a lot of his homework when it comes to Bitcoin and what all the benefits are of it.
Yeah, I think he's got the right people in his ear, though. We saw recently that Michael Saylor was at Mar-a-Lago taking a picture with Eric Trump. I had the opportunity to hear Eric Trump speak at Bitcoin MENA in Abu Dhabi. He seems to understand it far more than his dad does, and it seems like Trump's building a pretty good team in terms of Bitcoin policy. So I think he'll start to understand it more.
Yeah, 100%. I'm very confident that Trump is a type of guy that has had a bunch of time to sit on it. I think it's a unique situation where he was president 4 years ago, right? So at that time, he more than likely was sitting there being like, okay, I'm going to run for president. And I think he surprised himself a little bit when he actually won. Then he's like, all right, oh, crap. Now what? Now what am I going to do? And so he was trying to figure it out. He ran on the narrative, drain the swamp. And he didn't necessarily do that in 2016 to 2020. Now he's had 4 more years to sit on it. Hey, what would I do differently if I was reelected as president? And I think he's really putting in great people in place. That includes Eric Trump and a lot of these other Bitcoiners. And he has the right people in his ear, to say the very least. I agree with that 100%. And it seems like he's trying to employ a lot of smart and intelligent people, and not just people that are shaking the right hands to be in power. And I think that is very encouraging for America. That's encouraging for the dollar. And it's encouraging for Bitcoin going forward as well, because it adds just so much validity, as you were saying, right? I mean, at this point, if nation states get in, if the United States gets in, what can everybody say, right? I mean, we still have Jamie Dimon out there saying that Bitcoin's being used for sex trafficking and illegal activities, selling drugs, all these different things, but he's offering these ETF products and allowing his clients to purchase it. So I think the FUD is just smoke and mirrors at this point, and I think Bitcoin is something that cannot be denied, and soon everybody's going to wake up to that.
Yeah, Jamie Dimon, I'm glad you brought him up because you put out a video recently talking about JP Morgan. They launched a report breaking down Bitcoin and where it should belong in a portfolio, how to evaluate it. And also, JP Morgan is an authorized participant in these ETFs. So is he a secret hodler? What's going on with Jamie Dimon?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I always say, watch what they do, not what they say, right? So JP Morgan released a report that said you should have at least a 1% allocation to your portfolio when it comes to Bitcoin or other crypto assets, right? I mean, I think the banks at the end of the day are listening to their clients. Their clients don't necessarily know, hey, I should be Bitcoin, Bitcoin only. Eventually they're going to learn. But all of these big banks are coming around to the fact that, hey, my mom, who lost her Coinbase password or whatever it is now whooping their tail. All they had to do was just hold Bitcoin for this long period of time, and not just the S&P 500 and other aspects. And MicroStrategy was the best performing stock in the S&P 500. And what is MicroStrategy? Essentially just like a Bitcoin holding company at this point. Obviously, they have the background in the software and everything else, and that's very sticky. But if you look at the core business of MicroStrategy, it's been losing money. The one profitable thing about MicroStrategy is just it's able to utilize debt and buy more Bitcoin and create that flywheel. And so the other interesting aspect of this report, I didn't necessarily get into it in that video, was JP Morgan's now looking at a HODL case for each of the companies that hold Bitcoin on their balance sheet, meaning that they're multiplying the valuation for those companies that are following the MicroStrategy playbook. And it seems very intelligent, right? Because of how well MicroStrategy did. Now they're joining the NASDAQ 100, and it's seemingly taking off. And more companies are now looking at holding Bitcoin on their balance sheet. We've had, in the past month alone, we've had Microsoft, although they voted 99.5 or maybe even more percent said no, they're talking about it. They're one of the Magnificent Seven. We've got Meta now talking about it. We've got Amazon conducting the vote on whether to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet, I believe in April. So, all these different factors, we're not even just talking about nation states now. We're talking about large corporations looking at these playbooks, and Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan and all of these other large banks, institutional investors have to look at that. They have to say, hey, am I just going to ignore all these factors? Am I going to just ignore all these companies really looking at putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet instead of cash reserves? Does that make sense? No, they have to give it a serious look. And I think that is basically what Jamie Dimon is doing. But he realizes that, hey, if I'm looking to get a financial advisor, I don't need JP Morgan. All I need to do is go buy Bitcoin, put it in cold storage, make sure I've got my seed phrase stored securely in a place that I'm not going to forget about it. And I'll whoop the tail of any institutional investor at JP Morgan easily. And I think Jamie Dimon is realizing that. And so that's why he's giving that narrative out there, because he's still very influential character, whether the Bitcoin space wants to admit it or not. To the average person, they're going to listen to Jamie Dimon. So with that, I mean, I think that Jamie Dimon is trying to play chess, not checkers, but we're all reading through the tea leaves here, and we all know that secretly he's bullish on Bitcoin, or else he wouldn't be telling his clients or having people in his firm release a report like, hey, you need at least 1% allocation.
Yeah, I think you and I and the audience are reading through the tea leaves, but I don't think the average normie is. I think they take what he says at face value. The Jamie Dimons and Warren Buffetts of the world, which to me you would think with President Trump himself, kind of the king of fiat land, if you will, being pro Bitcoin, you would see the average person become more pro Bitcoin. As far as the people in my network, normies, so to speak, none of them are really getting it, despite all of the bullish factors that you and I see so clearly. Do you see the same thing in your neck of the woods? And what would it take for the average person to actually adopt Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset for their personal balance sheet?
I think it just takes seeing other people do it, man. I personally think that, they're listening still to the Warren Buffetts of the world, and a lot of people are just resistant to Trump. They see him as a businessman. Maybe even if they voted for him, they're still kind of skeptical about him. But Warren Buffett was late to Apple, openly late to Apple. He's openly admitted, hey, I was late to it. I didn't see it. And now I do. And if he would have, when he first talked about Apple, if he would have bought Apple then, he would have been a lot wealthier than he is today. And he's one of the best investors of all time. I think the unique aspect of all this is that no matter what you see in the market, it's very difficult to explain. Like Warren Buffett and value investing really resonated with a lot of people. Hey, if you look at a company's balance sheet, it's, the price to earnings ratio, whatever it is, these things are advantageous to buy because the stock market or the stock should go up because they're earning a lot more money, et cetera, et cetera. Well, value investing's been dead for over a decade. Warren Buffett's been getting his tail whipped by all these people getting into Tesla, Nvidia, all these different things. And if you ask the traditional investor, they can't explain why Nvidia keeps running up. They can't explain why Tesla keeps running up. It's overvalued. It's overvalued. They're screaming it all over FinTwit. And I think that, people are still learning and coming around to money in general. I think majority of people don't want to think about money at the end of the day, Mitch. And I think we're some of the psychopaths that really just thought about money and thought about, how we want our lives to look prior to, really getting into Bitcoin. And that's how we were able to find it. And so I think majority of Americans, they just want to, work their 9 to 5, go sit on their butt, watch the NFL during the weekend, maybe gamble a little bit on sports, toss $5, $10, $20, $50 on a game and just have fun with it and forget about it, wipe their hands of it and not necessarily think about, Bitcoin or anything else. But I think the true driver is price. I mean, personally, I've had one of my good buddies finally come around to Bitcoin when Bitcoin hit 100,000. I wrote our newsletter at the beginning of 24 that I said Bitcoin was going to hit 100,000. The Fed wasn't going to cut interest rates till Q4, just based on all the things that I was seeing. And I have a screenshot from him that Bitcoin was at 60K and he's chirping me saying in quotes, oh, Bitcoin's going to hit 100,000. And then when Bitcoin hit 100,000, he hit me up. All right, dude, you were right. How do I do this? So I think slowly but surely people are coming around. But the problem is a lot of people still conflate Bitcoin with crypto. So they think you're gambling, you got lucky. It's not till, maybe another year or two or when Bitcoin crashes that they're going to potentially say, start rubbing it in your face or whatever it is. So, I think it's just going to take time. And with that, we'll see the price rapidly run up and, everybody will get Bitcoin at the price they deserve.
Yeah, I agree. Number go up is the ultimate pathway to Bitcoin adoption. You and I can make podcasts and tweet and write books and all that, but most people won't start listening until they see that price go up and they start to FOMO and into greed sets in. And you're right about the average American. Like they have different hobbies outside of studying markets and looking at numbers, because I think for most people, Bitcoin, it just started as a hobby. In your free time, you were interested in how can I make more money? And then ultimately you're led to discover, man, the dollar as we know it is not even money at all. And when you talk about people freaking out saying, oh, Nvidia or Apple or Amazon, they're overvalued. Overvalued according to what? According to a fiat currency that can be printed endlessly. If you want to say that, I might not agree. But if you want to say overvalued to Bitcoin, which can't be printed. There's only 21 million. There's a finite supply. I would say, yeah, they are overvalued. And if you're just the regular person listening to this, we're talking about the United States, Japan, China, Canada, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, all these institutions and companies, countries buying Bitcoin. There's only 21 million of these. How much should the regular person actually, like, how much do they really need to accumulate? Because you're going to get some big bidders here. How much Bitcoin would you say is theoretically enough Bitcoin?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you should try to stack as much as you can and be as aggressive as you possibly can to get in, because I have a feeling we might not ever see below a six-figure Bitcoin ever again. But to get there, right, it sounds like a lot of money. Okay, I need to get 100,000 to get a full Bitcoin. That sounds unobtainable, so I'm just going to sit on the sidelines. No, I think you can start with something even as simple as 0.21, so 21 million sats. And I think that's the beauty of Bitcoin, is people don't even realize that you could buy into Bitcoin with just $1 and get started. But if you look at the way that Bitcoin has been developing over time, we've got millions of wallets that have had we have thousands of wallets that have nearly one Bitcoin and haven't moved that in quite some time. Now, I think that the number is peaked, and I don't think that we're ever going to see, that really increase anymore, because it's just, quite frankly, pretty unobtainable to get another full Bitcoin unless it's a nation state or unless it's a large corporation. Very few people have just $100,000 just sitting around ready to smash buy some Bitcoin. So I think that, with all of that being said, I think that that 0.21 number that my friend Brian Harrington always says is a great number to throw out there, where you still get the denomination of the 21 million Bitcoin sitting in there. You can aim for it. It's about 21 grand right now, which sounds very expensive. But if you wanted to buy a starter home, right? I mean, even if you only put in 3.5% down, a $400,000 home, you got to come to the table with more than 40 grand with after all the fees and everything like that. So at this point in time, it makes more sense to buy Bitcoin than to buy a home and plan for your retirement by buying Bitcoin and just hodling over time. It's truly the only scarce asset that we've ever seen in our entire life, and that is just provable that it's scarce. You don't know, we had Elon Musk talking about mining gold off of asteroids. You could always build up on real estate. We could have real estate on the moon someday. Who knows? But the only thing that is certain is that there's going to be 21 million Bitcoin, and whatever you get is what you're going to get, right? So try to provide as much value as you can and stack up and try to get that to that 0.21 number as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And the comparison of Bitcoin versus real estate right now really shows the negatives with real estate. For example, if we look at these California fires, right? If you said, oh, I have a beachfront property in Malibu, you can't make any more Malibu beachfront property, but you have property taxes, you have natural disasters, you have all sorts of things. I mean, you have bad landlord-tenant relationships in those kinds of environments as well. I know, squatting is a big problem in certain parts of the country, right? There's all these hidden costs with real estate, on top of the fact that most people who quote unquote own real estate, they still have a mortgage. They're still in debt. They're still, it's not a bearer asset in that sense. And so if you're thinking of purely what's the best way to move value from today to 10 years from now, it's absolutely Bitcoin, and it's not real estate.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you one caveat here, Mitch, is if you already own your home, or if you're looking to buy a home, if you have your wife or kids or whatever and you'd like to have a home, there is one thing that Bitcoin doesn't offer, and that's what Michael Saylor's pointed out. It's that infinite money glitch. In the United States, the banks love to throw you money, Mitch. They love to throw it to you. So if you've got a house and you have a lot of equity in there, you could pull out some of that equity and buy Bitcoin, and this home equity line of credit, they'll charge you interest only payments for the first 10 years. And then the second 10 years, then you got to pay down the principal. I imagine however much Bitcoin that you buy from a HELOC, obviously it's not financial advice, but however much you buy, if you're able to pull out 80 grand, say, of equity from your house, you could pay that down with $600 a month for 10 years, use that money to buy Bitcoin and create the Michael Saylor flywheel for yourself to help stack more sats, utilizing hard assets in order to buy more Bitcoin. So that is the one benefit and the one caveat I say about owning real estate. There are some tax advantages, but of course, it really depends on a few different factors, right? I mean, I'm in Florida for the majority of the time, right? I mean, I got to worry about hurricanes. California, you got to worry about potential fires. So, I mean, it really depends on like where you end up, what different things. I don't necessarily think it's the best thing to do is to own your home, and because of the amount of depreciation you see with all this different stuff. But if you've already made that decision, or you want that comfortability, there is tools that we can use now that, because the banking system is just tossing the Biden bucks to you, you can use that to create your own infinite money glitch and become your own personal Michael Saylor and make your estate your own micro strategy.
That's a great point. And I really wish you could borrow money with the same terms of a mortgage to just do other stuff to buy Bitcoin. This is something people don't understand about fiat money. And I like to blame Dave Ramsey because he's like, I'll pay off all your debts always, all the time, even if it's a mortgage with low interest rates, right? If you, in the scenario you've laid out, if you can borrow and your monthly payment, interest only is $600 a month for 10 years, well, you have to imagine over the next 10 years, one, the Bitcoin you bought is going to appreciate in value. Plus your income's going to rise, right? You're going to get a raise at some point. And so that $600 a month as a percentage of all the income you bring in is going to become, a smaller percentage, right? And so this is kind of the hack of fiat, which is your debts get devalued away in real terms. And this is ultimately the grand playbook of the United States, right? They have $36 trillion in debt, but if they can increase the money supply, that's getting devalued in real terms. So it's, the end game with fiat is like, have as much debt as possible, as long as you're using that debt to purchase assets. Getting in credit card debt to go on a Disney World trip is a different thing than what we're talking about.
Yeah, 100%. And, Dave Ramsey, everybody gives him very like a bunch of crap in the Bitcoin space because he says exactly that. But I think majority of Bitcoiners are very smart with the money. I think Dave Ramsey has a place for those people, like you're saying, right? I want to take my family to a vacation to Disney, and I'm going to go in massive amounts of credit card debt for that. That's where I think Dave Ramsey is good. But I think for majority of people, you're going to figure out, hey, debt is actually a good thing. Debt is a tool that the current fiat system lets us use to get more assets. Like Robert Kiyosaki always says, he's now become a Bitcoiner, but previously he was like, get in as much debt as possible. As long as you can afford the payments, dump as much money in. If they're going to lend you money, why don't you use it? And first that asset was real estate for him. And now I think he's seeing the light with Bitcoin where, you could utilize these debt tools to buy Bitcoin. And I mean, if I could buy, $300,000, $400,000 worth of Bitcoin at a 2.75 interest rate, which mortgages were at, just a measly 4 years ago. If I could do that, I would have, and I only needed to put 30 grand down. I would have done that in a heartbeat. But unfortunately, we don't have those tools yet. But you could utilize, real estate or some other assets like that. Maybe if you have a stock portfolio, they let you borrow against that to buy Bitcoin. And eventually, everybody's going to be shorting the dollar to buy more Bitcoin and just further accelerate that adoption.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. You want to short the weak money that can be printed infinitely, and you want to use it to acquire the hard assets that can't be printed. What is your kind of bear case and bull case for 2025 in terms of the Bitcoin price?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So I think bear case is just getting to 250,000. I think that is the absolute minimum, just because we're seeing 25 different nation states. We're seeing 3 out of the 7 magnificent 7 talking about Bitcoin and putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet. And I think hundreds of other companies are going to follow suit, especially if somebody like Meta definitely gets into Bitcoin or anything like that. But, I think that those are going to take some time to develop. And so I think just with Trump getting into office, potentially lowering interest rates, even if he keeps interest rates at a high, and all we see is, the rumblings of who this country might be stacking, but no formal announcement. I think at a minimum, we're going to see Bitcoin get to 250,000. Now, the bull case, this is where I think things get crazy. I think we could be seeing upwards of 850, 950 to maybe even $1 million of Bitcoin, because we'll see nation states just all start to FOMO in. And here's a little caveat for you, Mitch. I think we might see Mark Zuckerberg become more of a Bitcoin bull than Michael Saylor. Currently, he's the only CEO that has that power to be able to do exactly what Michael Saylor did. And he's got a goat named Bitcoin and Max. So I know he already tried to get in with, his Meta token or whatever it was, but he's now looking at these different kinds of things. He's looking at what Michael Saylor's doing, and he's now brought on Dana White, who is a very free speech kind of guy, and the UFC was sponsored by crypto.com, so he's had his fair share of exposure. And I think that Mark Zuckerberg might have that opportunity to be one of the biggest Bitcoin holders in the world with Facebook or Meta or whatever you want to call it now, and just personally him start to stack and increase his wealth that way. So not only have we seen Jeff Bezos and Amazon start to consider that, and Bezos being pictured on Michael Saylor's yacht, but I think the other one, the sneaky one that we're just seeing, is this new rebranding from Mark Zuckerberg, and where he could potentially be bigger than Michael Saylor and potentially be a bigger Bitcoin bull than Michael Saylor, just because he has more access to that capital. So I think 25 is going to be an interesting year. And I think if none of those things happen, at the very least, we're seeing 1.5x at the very least. And if not, we're going to see some things really blow off the top, and it's going to make for a very exciting 2025.
Yeah, I think the same thing about Zuckerberg. Bigger than Michael Saylor may be a stretch. He's got a lot of catching up to do. But like you said, Bitcoin and Bitcoin Maxi are his goats. He's doing this total rebrand vibe shift. He's doing jujitsu, eating meat, going on Joe Rogan. He's trying to make Instagram and Facebook more pro free speech. There is an aura shift, whether it's organic or whether this is totally manufactured. I don't know. It's anybody's guess. A lot of people seem to think it's bogus, but it is happening. And he owns more than 50% of the controlling shares of Meta. So if he wanted to, he could do that. He could take them on a Bitcoin standard, just like MicroStrategy.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's unique because out of all of the companies in the S&P 500, I think the only one that had more control that is bigger than MicroStrategy is Meta. So that's the only reason why I think he could potentially be bigger than Michael Saylor. And I think just, if you ask the average normie now, if you ask them who's Mark Zuckerberg, they would know. If you ask them who Michael Saylor is, very few people would know. Some of my normie friends do know who Michael Saylor is, simply because they have friends in Virginia that work at MicroStrategy, but aren't Bitcoiners. They just work at that company. So it is kind of interesting just seeing that. They're like, oh, this guy's a Bitcoiner. Like, I've heard of this company, MicroStrategy. A friend of mine works there, but I don't really know what they do. And that's kind of the extent of what the average person knows of MicroStrategy. But I think the interesting aspect of all of this is that, right now we're, Mitch, you and I, outside of the Bitcoin space, relatively unknown. Maybe we have our core group of friends, people we went to college with. I think the big other kicker that we're seeing in 25 is a lot of quote unquote influencers or influential people are now hinting at Bitcoin, right? I mean, one of the biggest YouTube channels there is, the Nelk Boys. I love watching their stuff. They're now sponsored by Kraken. Granted, Kraken offers all of the altcoins and everything else, but that's exposure to literally millions of people every single episode that they put on their podcast to Bitcoin. So the more touch points that all these people really see, I think the more that we're going to see people get on board with different type of cryptos and Bitcoin. And then eventually maybe they get burned, but they'll all convert over to Bitcoin eventually, right? I think everybody will think, like we all did in the initial phase, oh, I'm smarter than everybody else. I'm going to go try to dabble in Pepe the Frog coin or whatever it is. But more of these influential people are going to come onto board onto a Bitcoin standard, and they're going to bring on everybody else because they have that influence. So I think 25 is going to be different than any other year that we've seen, simply because of the amount of influential people that are coming, the amount of nation state FOMO that we're going to see, and the amount of corporate FOMO that we're going to see. And it's making all for this giant cocktail of Bitcoin popping off here. So we'll be at the end of this year throwing maybe a $250K party or a $1 million Bitcoin party opposed to the 100K party that we had this year.
I would love to see that. And I want you to put on your tinfoil hat here for a second. I don't know if I've ever asked anybody that's on the pod, but you mentioned MicroStrategy, headquartered Northern Virginia. Michael Saylor been making some trips to Mar-a-Lago, really hammering the idea that, hey, U.S. needs to buy Bitcoin. U.S. needs to buy Bitcoin. Since November, when Trump won the presidential election, MicroStrategy has just gone pedal all the way to the metal, borrowed billions and billions, like more than, I think they almost doubled their Bitcoin holdings from, 250 something thousand over 400,000. They have just gone all in. If I were the president and I wanted to accumulate Bitcoin strategically, I don't think you can come out and announce a smash buy directly. Maybe you see where I'm going with this. Could Michael Saylor or MicroStrategy be accumulating on behalf of the U.S. government, or am I totally out of my mind?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely believe that there is a possibility that Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy could be quietly stacking for the United States government. I think it's an interesting thought experiment, but the one caveat I have to all that is I'm not quite sure that Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy hold their own keys. I definitely think that it's unrealistic to think that there's a multi-sig of maybe 21 different employees that are holding Bitcoin or holding their seed phrase and diversifying throughout the entire company. I think that it's more likely that they have a trusted custodian like a Fidelity or somebody along those lines in order to hold Bitcoin for them. So they probably have it diversified between, a Fidelity, Coinbase, etc. So I'd be interested to really see their full custodial solution there. And I think that, secretly they might be helping the United States government stack right before Trump gets in. I know that they're probably worried a little bit about the FOMO of everybody else coming in. I mean, President Trump has already come out and said that he'd like to stack in the background and not do an executive order that would be public and everybody would know that, hey, I'm going to do this scheduled by, which is part of my bull case originally before he came out and said that 425 is that everybody's going to try to front run the U.S. government and other governments. So I think it's going to be an interesting year, Mitch. I think Michael Saylor is definitely rubbing elbows at Mar-a-Lago, is extremely bullish for everything going forward. And man, I'm just excited that, hey, we all beat BlackRock. We all beat the United States government. We all beat all of these people to Bitcoin. We saw the light first, and now everybody's starting to come along, and it's just really validating to know that, hey, we're here now.
Yeah, now we get to sit back and, cross our legs and watch them pump our bags. I'm excited. It's going to be a great year. Brandon, where can the audience find you and keep up with you? Because I know you're going to be pumping out mad valuable content all year long.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me. You guys can find me at Green Candle. Just go to Green Candle on YouTube and Green Candle IT everywhere on social media. If you know the guy that has the Green Candle handle on X or on Instagram or anything, be sure to tell him to hit me up, man, so I could drop that IT at the end. But outside of that, man, keep up the great work. Everybody subscribe to my man Mitch's channel. I know he puts in the work. So smash the like button, give a subscribe button to my man. And yeah, man, thank you so much for having me on.